Welcome to Confronting the Holocaust in Mid-Century American Art. In this talk, we will explore the ways that American artists, American-born immigrants, refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe, and Holocaust survivors confronted the Holocaust in their work during the war and in the decades just after. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We tell untold stories of artists marginalized and persecuted by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. I'm honored now to introduce today's speaker, Jennifer McComas, who is curator of European and American art at the Eskenazi Museum of Art, Indiana University, and is also an affiliated faculty member with the university's Jewish Studies program. She established and manages the museum's World War II era provenance research project and is now working on projects exploring experience and identity in the 20th century. Dr. McComas has lectured widely and contributed to a range of academic publications. Her research has received support from the Henry Luce Foundation, the Terra Foundation for American Art, and the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. After the conversation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the invitation to speak today. I'm very honored to share some of my research. This is research that I've conducted in conjunction with an exhibition that's currently on view at the Eskenazi Museum of Art, Remembrance and Renewal, American Artists and the Holocaust, 1940 to 1970. And this project is the result of 5 years of research and planning. It will be on view through December 14th. So this exhibition developed partly out of my extensive background with World War II era provenance research, in which I've investigated the wartime provenance or ownership histories of European art objects in the Eskenazi Museum's collection. World War II era provenance research focuses on the Jewish victims of Nazi art looting, and as such, it provides critical insight into the scope of the Holocaust. The Remembrance and Renewal exhibition offers a very different perspective on what we can learn about the Holocaust through the visual arts. The 74 works in the exhibition, all produced by artists living in the United States, broaden our understanding of how art was deployed during and after the Nazi-perpetrated genocide as a means of witnessing, documentation, resistance, survival, memory, therapy, and hope. So here are a couple of installation shots. With Remembrance and Renewal, I set out to learn how the cataclysmic events in Europe between 1933 and 1945 reverberated among artists who, for the most part, witnessed them unfolding from afar. With a few exceptions, this exhibition presents work by Jewish artists who were first or second generation Americans. A few were refugees, fortunate to find escape routes out of Europe in the 1930s or early 1940s, and a few were survivors who remade their lives in the US after the war. But most were immigrants or the American-born children of immigrants, arriving in the US prior to 1924, but often retaining bonds with Eastern European communities undergoing destruction. Most of the artists featured in the show were therefore secondary witnesses. Artists as secondary witnesses, writes the art historian Dora Appel, are those who confront the horror of the Nazi genocide and the suffering of its victims, and who continue to bear witness through reconfigured forms of testimony to events they have never seen or experienced. Because of their distance from the events, secondary witnesses may not deal with the Holocaust directly, but in ways that bring to the surface the tensions and discontinuities between the past and the present, ambiguities, impasses, and lacunas that are part of the memory effects of the Shoah. Most exhibitions that have presented so-called Holocaust art have focused on work by the victims themselves, or conversely, on contemporary art. A recent example of the former approach was an exhibition called My Story, Early Memory of the Holocaust in the Works of Eyewitness Artists, on view at the Hungarian National Gallery in Budapest in 2024. The works of art in that exhibition functioned primarily as forms of resistance or testimony, qualities that have been perceived as separate from the main concerns of modernist art. Indeed, the museum's website acknowledged that the works in the exhibition, quote, standing on the borderline between works of fine art, historical documents, and trauma processing, did not belong to the Hungarian artistic canon up until now, unquote. Remembrance and Renewal is likewise the first exhibition to examine mid-century American art about the Holocaust, and to do so within multiple contexts, situating the work within the realm of post-war modernism and simultaneously as expressions of Jewish identity and perspective, and as personal responses to trauma and catastrophe. With certain exceptions, the artists featured in the exhibition worked within the circles and structures of the mainstream American art world. Some were actively involved in artistic developments such as abstract expressionism and minimalism, and the work they made in response to the Holocaust is formally innovative. Others were successful during their lifetimes, but have largely fallen out of the canonical narrative of mid-century American art. While the Holocaust was not their only or even primary subject, this exhibition has offered an opportunity to bring their work back to light. Much more remains to be discovered about the ways that American artists addressed the Holocaust in this period. Relevant works continue to come to my attention, while others that are mentioned in older publications can no longer be located. During and immediately after the war, artists had few models or precedents for creating visual art about an atrocity of such magnitude and one to which many were personally connected. Unlike some contemporary art about the Holocaust, mid-century artists rarely depicted or referred to the atrocities explicitly or in graphic detail. Documentary photographs and films did not become available until after the war, but even then, artists did not often draw upon atrocity imagery as they struggled to process their trauma, grief, and rage. Harold Paris, who covered the liberation of Buchenwald as a news correspondent, could have drawn upon his memories of what he had witnessed when he produced his Buchenwald series, a portfolio of 9 engravings, in 1948. Instead, he chose to represent the mass murder symbolically, as in this image of mourners surrounding a dead child. Artists grappled with the ethical implications of depicting physical violence inflicted upon human bodies. In confronting mass murder through art, they had to contend with the possibility that the atrocities would be aestheticized and even perceived as beautiful. Harold Paris's solution was embraced by many artists during the war and in the years after. Symbolism, metaphor, and abstraction all offered ways to respond to the Holocaust without directly depicting it. Because Christian iconography was perceived as universally recognizable, it is not surprising to find that a number of Jewish artists turned to crucifixion imagery during the Holocaust to represent the concept of martyrdom. However, artists like the Chicago-based Todros Geller did so on their own terms. In Geller's 1942 composition, Another Crucifixion or the Martyr, he presents a figure on a cross, clothed in a talit or Jewish prayer shawl. In the lower right, another man carries a Torah scroll salvaged from the ravaged landscape he leaves behind. He is accompanied by a goat. an animal that frequently appears both in the Torah and in Yiddish folklore, here possibly representing cultural continuity, though juxtaposed with extreme suffering. Indeed, Jewish symbolism, language, and ideas occur more often than one might expect in mid-century American art. Jewish texts and rituals do offer many tools for dealing with trauma and its aftermath, but they also helped artists reconnect with a culture from which many had become disengaged, but now wish to preserve and memorialize through their work. Identifying and interpreting the often subtly embedded Jewish references in post-war art was therefore an important aspect of my project, offering a new way of understanding post-war art. While most artists avoided explicitly depicting Holocaust victims and the depths of their suffering, they did not avoid the subject of mass murder. Ben Sion directly alludes to mass graves in his stylized images of traditionally garbed Jewish men clustered in pits, their heads covered with their talitot, and of hands reaching up from the earth in a desperate attempt at escape and survival. Rico Lebrun, a non-Jewish immigrant from Italy, produced a series of paintings bearing titles referencing the concentration camps of Dachau and Buchenwald, basing them on photographs of Holocaust victims published in 1946 in U.S. Camera Annual. Although Lebrun's compositions are stylized and abstracted, the viewer is nevertheless confronted by images of bones and bodies lying on floors, piled in carts, or stuffed into crematoria. Other artists addressed the destruction instead through the iconography of exile, connecting the Holocaust to the long history of Jewish displacement and migration. These compositions by Anna Walinska and Joseph Freibert depict refugees making their way through indeterminate landscapes, recalling Samuel Hirschenberg's iconic Exile. Painted in response to the 1903 pogrom in the Bessarabian city of Kishinev, Hirschenberg's composition was widely exhibited and reproduced prior to World War II, including on postcards. Mitchell Saporin's refugees, packed onto a ship bound for mandatory Palestine, are more clearly identified as Holocaust survivors, with the figures in the foreground prominently displaying concentration camp tattoos on their arms. Towards the back of the ship, the ghost-like figure of a man garbed in religious dress stands out. Perhaps he represents the millions of dead whose memories are carried forward by the survivors. Some artists turn their attention to the perpetrators, with varying degrees of explicitness. In two collages he never publicly exhibited, Italian immigrant Joseph Stella inserted newspaper clippings referring to the Polen Aktion, the October 1938 deportation from Germany of approximately 17,000 Jews holding Polish citizenship. In 1938, Stella could not have foreseen that most of these Jews would later be murdered. But as an immigrant in a country where anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic attitudes were pervasive, he must have felt empathy for their plight. Jimmy Ernst, son of acclaimed German surrealist Max Ernst, fled Germany for the U.S. in the same year, 1938, at the age of 18. His Jewish mother, Louise Strauss Ernst, was unable to join him and perished at Auschwitz. Ernst's first trip back to Germany in the early 1960s was a traumatizing experience, which he processed through paintings such as Crystal Night of 1963. The title is a translation of Kristallnacht, the so-called Night of Broken Glass, the pogrom carried out against Jews in Germany and Austria on the night of November 9th and 10th, 1938, not long after Ernst's departure. The ruined wall dominating the composition evokes the physical destruction of property, with a close examination revealing stars of David etched into its glass-like surface, simultaneously evoking shattered windows and anti-Semitic graffiti. The web of black lines above are suggestive of the barbed wire surrounding the death camps. Yet Ernst may have also had the Allied bombing of Germany's cities in mind, emphasizing that the country's own devastation was the consequence of its destruction of the Jewish life and culture that had previously thrived there. Even more confrontational are the 33 life-size drawings in Mauricio Lasansky's Nazi Drawings series. Mixed media compositions, these works convey raw and visceral emotion. When the series toured North America as an exhibition in 1967, one critic called it the most powerful artistic indictment of the Nazi destruction ever created. Lasansky made these works after watching the 1961 televised trial of Adolf Eichmann, known as the Final Solution's chief architect. But Lasansky's wrath was not reserved for Eichmann or the Nazis alone. He also holds the Catholic Church accountable, here depicting two clergymen standing on the bodies of dead Jewish children. The 29th drawing in the series, Lasansky likely produced this work after the Church's 1965 resolution condemning anti-Semitism, which resulted from the Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 65. While the Jewish community welcomed this statement, many were greatly disappointed at the Church's failure to apologize for the centuries of anti-Jewish violence it had perpetrated or condoned, which many saw as leading up to the Holocaust. While Lasansky was eager to confront the public with the Nazi drawings, other artists produced highly personal, even private expressions of pain and trauma. Hannelore Baron, born near the German city of Saarbrücken, grappled with the trauma of Kristallnacht and her family's subsequent migration to the US through works of art that do not obviously represent those experiences. She described the box assemblages she began creating in the late 1960s as memorials and remnants of some kind of a disaster. These works hide their full meaning, yet clearly presents the artist's concerns with concealment and secrecy, as suggested by the twine-wrapped fabric of the 1981 box B81063. One of her earliest box assemblages, Hidden Entrance, makes these concerns more explicit through its title, which directs us to perceive its seemingly haphazard arrangement of wood fragments nailed in place as a boarded-up entrance, evoking stories of Jews who hid from the Nazis. Boris Lurie, a survivor, produced his war series as a form of therapy following his relocation to the US in 1946. Lurie had spent much of the war confined in the Riga ghetto. His grandmother, mother, sister, and girlfriend were all shot in the nearby forest in December 1941. Eventually, Lurie and his father were sent to the Stutthof concentration camp near Danzig and later transported to Buchenwald, where he was forced to work as a slave laborer in an ammunition factory. In his painting, Prisoners Returning from Work, we are faced with a nightmarish scene of figures surging through a dark, tunnel-like space. It is unclear if they are attempting to escape or in fact running towards their deaths. Lurie never exhibited this or other works from his war series during his lifetime, taking a very different approach in his public-facing work. His Immigrants No suitcase is collaged with Stars of David, swastikas, photographs of death camp victims, and clippings from pornographic magazines. The suitcase may be the one he brought with him to the US as a refugee, providing this provocative work with an autobiographical meaning and symbolizing the trauma he literally carried with him as a survivor. Whereas Lurie used symbols that are widely comprehensible, such as swastikas and Stars of David, the full meaning of works incorporating Hebrew text is legible only to those with the ability to read the texts and identify the sources from which they are extracted. Then Sean turned to the Yom Kippur liturgy in his print commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which occurred in the spring of 1943. Beneath the figure, whose hunched pose and balled-up fists evokes the traditional posture denoting melancholy, Sean has placed a slightly altered version of the following Hebrew lament. And I'll read it first in Hebrew. Ele ezkara v'nafshi alai eshpecha, ki v'lo'unu zedim k'ugab li hafucha, ki v'mei hasar lo al tarucha, la'asara haruge malocha. So in English, this says, "These I remember, and my soul pours out within me. For wicked people have swallowed us like an unturned cake. For in the days of the tyrant, there was no reprieve for the 10 martyrs murdered by the government." This passage is taken from a martyrology read on Yom Kippur morning and refers to 10 2nd-century rabbis martyred during the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. A viewer familiar with his liturgy will note that Sean has removed the word asara, meaning 10, thus making the text applicable to the millions of Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Samuel Bach places just one Hebrew word in his lo against blue space, but it is a powerful one. Bach's image, in which lo, Hebrew for no, is carved on a set of fractured stone tablets, evokes a network of associations for a Jewishly knowledgeable viewer. The simplest reading is that most of the 10 commandments begin with the word lo. Here, the word occupies the top of the left-hand tablet, which, because Hebrew is read from right to left, is the second of the 2. In Jewish representations of the 10 commandments, this is the traditional placement for the 6th commandment, lo tirtzach, do not murder, which was, of course, horrifically broken during the Holocaust. But Bach's composition also alludes to Moses' breaking of the tablets upon witnessing the worship of the golden calf in the book of Exodus. Midrash, or Jewish interpretive legend, states that the people carried those shattered tablets together with a second unbroken set in the Ark of the Covenant, keeping even a painful memory alive in their presence. And memory is a recurring theme in art about the Holocaust, remembering lost family members, places, and ways of life. The urge to remember gave rise to an entire genre of art recalling pre-war Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Memorial works of this nature began appearing as early as 1942 as more concrete information about the death camps and other Nazi-perpetrated atrocities became known in the United States. William Gropper's De Profundis, depicting an elderly Jewish man at prayer, is the first of a series of similar portraits he made annually in commemoration of the dead. At the lower right of the composition appear the Hebrew words, Mi ma'amakim kraticha, from the depths I cried out to you. This is the opening phrase of Psalm 130, a text often recited at times of great distress. Ilya Shor, who grew up in a Hasidic community in Ukraine, drew upon his own memories in his illustrations for Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's 1950 book, The Earth is the Lord's, an elegy to traditional Ashkenazi life in Eastern Europe. Ruth Weisberg's 1971 intaglio print portfolio, The Shtetl, A Journey and a Memorial, evokes life in a pre-war shtetl, or predominantly Jewish town in Eastern Europe. The 9 images in the portfolio are based on pre-war photographs she studied at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York. Some of her compositions are likely based on family photographs she discovered there, while others appropriate compositions by professional photographers that circulated in memorial books after the war. For example, Waiting is based on an image by Polish Jewish photographer Alter Kaczizna who had worked for the Forward, one of the most widely disseminated Yiddish newspapers in the U.S. His image of day laborers standing on a street corner in Bialystok was reproduced in the 1947 memorial book Die verschwundene Welt, or The Vanished World, a bilingual Yiddish and English publication featuring 530 pre-war photographs of Jewish Eastern Europe. Weisberg's decision to present her shtetl series in a book format, with mounted prints alternating with pages containing her own poetic text, alludes to the importance of books in Jewish culture, not just the role that the texts themselves play in Jewish study and ritual practice, but because the portability of books has ensured the transmission and continuity of Jewish culture throughout centuries of persecution and migration. Less obviously than Weisberg's portfolio, Frank Stella's monumental Polish Village series, a group of 130 mixed media works, is also inspired by pre-war photographs, in this case depicting Polish wooden synagogues from the 17th and 18th centuries. His source photographs are found in the 1959 book Wooden Synagogues by the Polish architectural historians Maria and Kazimierz Piachotka. The book presents photographs and architectural drawings of 69 synagogues, all of which were burned down by the Nazis. Although Stella's compositions bear the names of the Polish towns where the synagogues formerly stood, his geometric abstractions do not bear any obvious visual relationship to the historic structures. Yet the relief's wood medium and intricate assembly reference the traditional carpentry techniques used in pre-modern Poland, while their brightly painted surfaces evoke the synagogue's heavily muraled interiors. When the Polish Village series was first exhibited in the 1970s, critics said nothing about its allusions to the Holocaust. Yet Stella later confirmed that the series was indeed about the obliteration of an entire culture. His work has helped keep the memory of these distinctive synagogues alive. Jewish memory rituals, such as the Passover Seder, tend to conceptually and performatively conflate past and present. We see a similar collapsing of time and also of geography in some post-Holocaust art. Samuel Bach, a survivor of the Vilna ghetto, presents us with a tomb-like shtetl incongruously situated in a desert. With this dead city, its windows and entrances sealed and shuttered, does he mean to evoke the Judean mountaintop fortress of Masada, where 2,000 years ago, over 900 Jews are believed to have committed suicide rather than surrender to the Romans? If so, Bach connects a distant tragedy with the recent one, interweaving ancient collective memories with his personal ones. Artists also played important roles in calling the broader public's attention to the genocide in Europe. The Polish-born illustrator Arthur Szyk, who arrived in New York in 1940, immediately began producing anti-Nazi caricatures and political cartoons for popular magazines. In 1943, he designed the program for We Will Never Die, a pageant produced by Hollywood screenwriter Ben Hecht. Debuting in March at Madison Square Garden in New York City, the pageant traveled to several other American cities in an effort to draw awareness to the ongoing slaughter in Europe. The program states that the event was dedicated to the 2 million Jewish dead of Europe, a fairly accurate statistic at that time. On the program cover, which repurposes the 1942 drawing called Tears of Rage, Szyk presents several archetypal Jewish victims, including a dying man, perhaps a rabbi, holding a richly dressed Torah scroll. But he also used this opportunity to subvert the already common perception that Europe's Jews were going passively to their deaths. The image is dominated by a Jewish soldier who fights the Nazi oppressors while protecting the vulnerable members of his community. His machine gun bears the label Made in the USA, perhaps a plea to the US government to send aid to the struggling Jews of Europe. As early as 1947, a memorial to Holocaust victims was proposed for a site in New York City's Riverside Park. Ground was broken for the American Memorial to 6 million Jews of Europe in October that year, with 15,000 people in attendance. Today, one can still visit the plaque that was installed and read its inscription honoring the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Battle and the 6 million Jews of Europe martyred in the cause of human liberty. Designs were solicited from artists and architects, and submissions included this proposal from Chaim Gross, which features a menorah-like structure surrounded by a curving wall carved with scenes from the Warsaw Ghetto. However, the memorial was never built, as no consensus could be reached about how to appropriately memorialize the destruction. Synagogues instead became the locations of the first Holocaust memorials constructed in the US. Louise Cache's Wall of Martyrs at Beth El Synagogue Center of New Rochelle depicts a linear narrative of Jewish historical suffering, from the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple to the Crusades, Spanish Inquisition, and Russian pogroms, and concluding with the Holocaust. Cache chose to represent the historical events through human figures, but felt the Holocaust required a different solution. How does one deal with the Holocaust, she asked, that part of our history which is part of our lives, and come away with one's faith intact? Ultimately, she settled on a composition based on a memory of her 1956 visit to Dachau, where she saw wildflowers growing from mass graves, a site she interpreted as a sign of renewal following destruction. Cache's memorial conveys a tension between life and death, destruction and renewal that is present in much art about the Holocaust. The 7 paintings comprising Morris Lewis's Charred Journal Fire Written series is on one level about the Nazi book burnings in the 1930s, as he explained to a Washington Post reporter in 1953. But his widow, Marcella Lewis Brenner, later suggested that he had tried to, quote, capture an effect of letters and symbols rising like ashes from the surface of a burned page, unquote. Thus, the text transcends destruction, serving as a metaphor for Jewish persistence, survival, and generative creativity, even evoking Kabbalistic traditions that the world itself was created from the fiery letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Artists who made and make art in response to the Holocaust do so for many reasons. For some, art making is a therapeutic practice, a means of working through pain, trauma, grief, or anger. For others, it is a way to commemorate victims and maintain a sense of continuity with what was destroyed. For some, art can be a vehicle for critique or accusation. And for many, engaging in the process of creation through art making is a life-affirming response to destruction, quite literally a means of survival, resilience, and hope. The ways that mid-century American artists confronted the Holocaust, whether as survivors, refugees, or secondary witnesses, and whether through the lens of avant-garde or more traditional aesthetics, expand our understanding of American art as the United States emerged from the war as a political and cultural power on the world stage. At the same time, identifying and analyzing the complex meanings embedded in many of these works shed light on the ways that American Jews grappled with their Jewish identity and culture in a time of trauma and transition. But perhaps most importantly, art made during and after the Holocaust can inspire us to appreciate the power of art to express what so often cannot be articulated in words. Thank you. I'm going to stop the share.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I invite everyone to please put questions in the Q&A or the chat boxes. And I will start right away with Leona's question. She says, I would be interested to get an opinion about the stylistic differences between Jewish and non-Jewish artists of the same time. Can this be manifested at all? Is there some element in their art that expresses something specifically Jewish, or is it just thematic?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I don't see any particular differences stylistically between the work of Jewish artists and non-Jewish artists. Um, Again, these artists were all working in one way or another within the mainstream American art world. They were going often to the same exhibitions and galleries. They were familiar with the current and emerging trends in modern art. Not every artist chose to engage in the same way with, say, abstract expressionism or other forms of abstraction, but I don't see any difference based on the artist's, cultural background. I will say that the one work that I showed that does reference a more, I guess, specifically Jewish art form was the illustration by Ilya Shor for Rabbi Heschel's book. And in those wood engravings, Shore seems to be trying to evoke the folk art of paper cutting, which was associated in Eastern Europe with the holiday of Shavuot in the spring. And so these paper cuts would be made and displayed in the home. However, there are probably also examples in Eastern European folk art of similar work.
Mhm. Thank you. Um, you mentioned, Monica is asking, you mentioned very briefly the incorporation of pornographic imagery in the work of Boris Loury. Could you please comment on this necessarily problematic issue? I'm thinking also of Robert Morris' post-war series.
Um, so my understanding about Boris Loury's use of pornographic imagery, which appears in quite a bit of his post-war collage work, is that it doesn't necessarily seem this way on the surface, but he was critiquing the exploitation of women, in particular in Western society and capitalist society. Um, but and so that's one level, but also going back to his experience in the Holocaust and the trauma of having all of his female relatives shot in 1941, and the way that he presumably saw female concentration camp victims being treated and sexualized. And so these would be some of the this is some of the background to his use of that imagery.
Mhm. Thank you. Joseph is asking, though Todor's Geller's painting is artistically beautiful, I still find it very discomforting that the crucifixion is used to symbolize Jewish suffering. What do you think?
Well, a lot of Jewish artists at the time would have agreed with that sentiment. Certainly not all were comfortable with the use of the crucifixion, which itself was invoked as a reason to persecute Jews in historical time periods. Um, but that said, I think because it was perceived as an image, a kind of iconography that was associated with martyrdom and with suffering, and again perceived to be recognizable in this kind of universal sense. Some Jewish artists, and Chagall in particular, I think most famously chose to use that imagery to, I think, convey what was happening to the Jews in Europe in a visual language that presumably the typical viewer could understand.
Mhm. Thank you. So, um, Stephen is asking, does the description of art evoke any feelings, including shame that the world stood by and didn't know or didn't want to know what was happening in Europe?
Does the work evoke shame? I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Does this description of art evoke any feelings, including shame that the world stood by and didn't know or didn't want to know what was happening in Europe?
Um, so I think from the perspective of some of these artists, they certainly did want to draw attention to the fact that the world stood by and did nothing. I think that's one of the messages in Lisansky's Nazi drawing series, and particularly why he brings in this critique of the Catholic Church, which in the 1960s, when he made these works, there was, discussion was beginning about, well, why didn't the church speak up more? And, why did they, quote, let this happen? Some other works that I didn't show, but that are part of the exhibition and can be seen in the accompanying catalog, also deal with the issue of the bystander. There's a work by the Austrian-born artist, for example, Henry Körner, who came to the US in 1939, I believe, later went back to Europe, and he served as the court artist at the Nuremberg trials, then returned to Vienna, found that his family had been murdered, and he made some paintings that very much deal with the question of bystanders, and he really asked the question, who's guilty, the one who perpetrates the crime or the one who stands by? I would say that Joseph Stella's collages incorporating the newspaper fragments about the deportation of immigrants also in a way, gets into the issue of bystanders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Susan is asking what women artists were active in this period with art relating to the Holocaust, and what impact did their art have?
So discovering the work of women artists whose work was relevant to this project was one of the most satisfying parts of my research. As I came across some women artists with whom I was not previously familiar. And in fact, we were able to acquire some of their work for our permanent collection in conjunction with the exhibition. So one of those artists was Anna Walinska, who was working in a fairly abstract mode in the 1950s. Her work really blends abstraction with figuration in a very interesting and dynamic way. And she created a series of works in the 50s about the Holocaust. I included one in this slideshow showing the group of survivors, walking together across a landscape. Hannelore Barron was another artist I wasn't previously very familiar with, so she made the box assemblages. So she was clearly looking at work that was happening in New York while she was living there, works by Joseph Cornell, for example, who was also using the box format and found objects, but then she imbues the works with this very personal meaning. I was also very fascinated by the fact that women artists were commissioned to make some of the earlier Holocaust memorials that, again, were found in synagogues. So I showed a work by Louise Caiche, really amazing sculptor who worked somewhat in the vein of Rodin, making monumental bronze sculptures. Also, Louise Nevelson, one of the more famous examples. She made a Holocaust memorial for a synagogue on Long Island. It's very much like her. It looks like her typical abstract work, but again has this additional meaning.
Yeah. So which Jewish artist used satire to depict the Holocaust? And thank you for a wonderful lecture, says Naomi.
Um, I'm not really sure how to answer that question. Um, Maybe the questioner could put a follow-up question into the chat because I'm not sure how we're looking at satire in this context, to be perfectly honest. or if you have a thought about that, Rachel, feel free to prompt me.
I don't know. I think Arthur Szyk reached. I don't know whether you could see his images as satire. Probably not, but he had his very own way of depicting the Nazis and what they did, and reached a really huge public by
True.
doing.
I think of his work more in the his work is drawing on the tradition of caricature going back to the 19th century. I don't think of that as satire. He
Right.
certainly makes fun of some of the dictators of the time, Hitler and others. Maybe we can call that satire, but it's I
Yeah,
suppose he's disempowering them a bit through his imagery,
yeah,
if only conceptually.
yeah. So Daniel is clarifying maybe less satire than irony.
Mhm.
Rosowski, Marianne, uh, P.S. Great lecture. But
Mhm.
Daniel is also asking before, can you tell us about the process of selecting artists for the exhibition? There's a very large galaxy of art dealing with the Holocaust. How do you narrow or condense this broad field?
Right. Yeah, that was challenging. This is a very broad topic. Many artists could have fit into the project. And I define American very broadly. So the exhibition, the publication are about American artists addressing the Holocaust. But the examples that I showed, I think indicate how broadly I decided to define American. So I didn't narrow things down too much from that perspective. But using my date parameters, I really wanted to look at the mid 20th century. Um, I did extend beyond the boundaries of 1940 to 1970 a little bit, but I tried to resist bringing in, the more contemporary examples, which I think are a bit better known already. And I was much more interested in bringing attention to works that haven't been particularly studied within this context, or at least not and haven't been seen together. Um, I did consult some of the existing literature. There's a small amount of literature on artists responding to the Holocaust in this time period. So that helped me begin to construct a checklist. I also looked to our own collection, and about a third of the works in the exhibition come from the permanent collection here at the Eskenazi Museum. Um, Many contacts that I made during the course of my research, whether other scholars or representatives of artists' estates and foundations, were also very helpful in drawing my attention to some of the lesser known works and artists.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was a difficult task to narrow down.
Yes, brilliantly solved. I should say. So Monica is asking, I'd welcome your thoughts about the uses of abstraction in grappling with the issue of Holocaust representation.
Mhm. Well, I did notice through this research that, and I believe I mentioned this earlier in the talk, that artists in this particular moment were less likely to portray the Holocaust through representational means. Again, I think partly stemming from the fact that most of the artists that I've discussed didn't see these events taking place. They didn't experience them directly. So they didn't have the kind of eyewitness sensibility.
Mhm.
And I think perhaps a reticence to try to portray something that you didn't know, something so horrible that you didn't know directly, and also a concern about disrespect for the victims. So I think that's part of it. I think this is also the moment when abstraction is really coming to the forefront in American art. And so I think some of the artists wanted to think about how could they use that visual language or languages, and how could they do that to address their own trauma, their own responses to what had happened. And I think abstraction, in fact, offers many tools on the symbolic and metaphorical level, as we saw with the work by Morris Louis. And so looking at the titles of the abstract works became very important to my interpretation, even though, of course, in the time, there was great reluctance to ascribe meaning to titles. And I think Frank Stella's work has been a particular example of this in the late 50s. And he did his series of black and white minimalist paintings called the Black Series. If three of those works have titles that refer to the Third Reich, but there was great resistance among critics to like draw any meaning from that initially. But I think today, from the perspective of several decades removed, we can look at those titles and say, well, even if the work doesn't visually scream at us what its subject matter is about, but the artist picked a title for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a
I
lot
think
of
even with Jimmy Arendt's Crystal Night, it might be, even though that work is a bit more representational, it might be difficult to know exactly what he's getting at in that work without the title. It could become a little bit more generic or universal in its meaning
Mm-hmm.
otherwise.
Yeah, thank you. Um, and Ellen is asking, one assumes that young people have been engaged in attending this exhibition. What feedback have you received from them?
Well, I think feedback that I've received that spans the generations. So this is not unique to young people, but I just want to say that the most I guess it's not surprising, but the responses that I've received from visitors, including, for example, some of our university students who have visited, has been a very emotional and personal kind of response. There are students who, for example, are they're grappling with anti-Semitism or with everything that's happening in the world around us, and the exhibition has been a bit of a grounding experience or validating, perhaps. And then we've had a number of visitors to the exhibition who are the descendants of Holocaust survivors, and it's been so gratifying to know that they are having a very moving and meaningful experience when they visit and they see this work. So I think that this has been really a multi-generational kind of response.
Mm-hmm. Um, is that true also for visitors who are not Jewish and haven't really been exposed to anything Jewish beyond what you present them in the museum?
I think so. And again, visitors they make connections to like more universal connections, let's say, or just on the emotional level. If the exhibition isn't necessarily teaching people about Holocaust history and all of its detail, although we do provide some resources if people would like to learn more. But I've also had some visitors, non-Jewish visitors, who have told me that um, they really wanted to see the exhibition because they had relatives, ancestors who had lived in Europe during the war. One person told me his grandfather had hidden Jews in the Netherlands, or people who are the descendants of World War II veterans who witnessed, some aspect of the Holocaust. So I think it's the resonance certainly is felt beyond the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's that goes in sync with my belief that art reaches people's heart and emotions, and opens them to new experiences and to new topics or to topics in a new way. So I think you're doing, uh, and I know from all the responses here, you're doing very important work, and everyone seems to have very much enjoyed your presentation. I Christine is asking one last question before our time is up. Have you faced any discrimination for working on this topic, especially given current world events?
I feel like I've been very supported, in fact, in working on this project, but from my colleagues here at the museum and from other colleagues in the field, and also from the many museums and collections that lent to the exhibition, and even some institutions who I requested loans from and they couldn't lend for whatever reason, the work's condition, for example, they still expressed a lot of support
Hmm.
for the project. So I actually feel like what I've seen has been really the opposite. I've received a lot of comments along the lines of this project seems very important at this time. And, um, I've been working on the show for 5 years, so the world has changed quite a lot during that time. So yes, it's interesting to see how this, maybe people's reactions would have been a little bit different if world events were slightly different, um, but to answer the question, no, I don't feel like I've received been discriminated against.
That's very, very encouraging. And yeah, I think the arts are a good vehicle to have difficult discussions, and especially on college campuses, so university campuses. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was a really, I hear it from all the sides, very, very powerful and important work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing it with us.